If you've ever experienced anything like this, or alternatively this, when you're pitching, the biggest difference between good players, low handicappers, and high handicappers is the release of the golf club. And that's pretty much consistent throughout the whole game, from long game to short game. But it particularly shows up with the short game. And it really does limit the potential of what you can do with the ball. We tend to get one-dimensional. With the same release every time, it makes it really difficult to adapt. And that's what good players are able to do. They're able to adapt to the conditions. They're able to regulate the distance, the flight, play different shots, develop a repertoire. And the high handicap golfer tends to have the same release all the time, unable to adapt, and is trying to play all these different shots with the same release. But the problem with that release is that it's so inconsistent with the striking, and it really shows up in pitching. And this is an area of the game that really separates low handicappers from high handicappers, because this is where your scores are made. So the low handicappers, they're using this part of the game to reduce their scores. They're making up and downs, shaving shots off their score. Yet the high handicapper is just hoping to get up and down or get down in 3 to try and save the score. So pitching's not just about saving your score, it's about lowering your scores. And that's the biggest difference between low handicappers and high handicappers. What I just did then was very typical of an early release. And what we're going to look at is, how do we recognise these different releases? Because the release I just made presents the loft like this, and the back of the sole like this. So typically, I'm going to hit the ball high if I make contact, but what I'm also bringing in is an early strike with the ground. And it's not always just the bounce we use, sometimes it can be the leading edge. So the first shot I made was a fat shot, the leading edge dug in. The second shot was still an early release, the back edge of the sole was presented, and it bounced and it thinned the ball. So two very different outcomes, very similar release. Because sometimes you can think you've done something different. You thin the ball through the green and you think, oh, I've hit it too hard. When actually what you did was thin the ball, and the thin shot will tend to go further. When you're striking it with the leading edge, halfway up the ball, it will shoot across the green. That's not because you've used too much club head speed, it's just because you've misstruck the shot. Alternatively, leading edge digging into the ground is obviously going to play the fat shot, so the ball just goes a few yards. So what is the low handicapper's release? That is the burning question. Well, what they're doing is they're releasing the club later. So what we've got here is a challenge, a crossbar challenge. If we stand about, I'd say 2 yards away, the challenge is to hit the ball under the crossbar and pitch it onto the green. So I'm about 30 yards away from the flag and I want to pitch it halfway. So it's got to fly about 15 yards, but we've got to start it underneath the crossbar. Now, the high handicapper with the early release is going to really struggle, even with a perfect strike, to get it underneath there. Their only chance of getting it underneath that crossbar is probably by hitting it off the bottom of the club and thinning it. That's their only chance, like that. And even that, I think, just shaved over the top. But the lower handicap golfer is able to drive that underneath and then get some check on the ball, get some spin control on that first bounce. That first bounce is critical. How that ball reacts on that first bounce is going to determine how much it rolls. A low shot is a much later release, and a high shot earlier. What is the release of the club? Well, if we talk about the wrists as a hinge, when those wrists unhinge, that is the release. Recognising when the golf club is rotating as opposed to travelling in a more linear fashion. But we're looking at the handle here, not the club head. Most people try to hit the ball with the club head, and in doing so, throw the club head at the ball very early, and that's the early release. The better players swing the club, the whole club, predominantly with the handle leading. And what this does now, this gives us the opportunity to control when we want to release it. So while the handle is leading and in particular the butt end of the handle, while that's leading, we're in control. We can determine when we want the club to swing down. We can determine when we want the club to release. But if we're just swinging it from side to side, I've got to be really now careful where I am in space doing this. I'd have to move my whole body to try and get a strike over here, or to try and get a descending angle of attack on the ball, because ultimately we have to de-loft the golf club. Even though we're pitching, we are de-lofting the club. For the average golfer to reduce their scores, all they've got to do is start to take control of the release. And it's recognising what is happening here and how this influences the shot. So first of all, we're going to explore the flail. We're going to lead the action with the handle. So taking the club with your trail hand, just start to flail the club back and forth like this, side to side. Not twisting the face, just side to side. Notice here, it's like a snake-like action with the butt end of the golf club leading. And then we can let the club rotate. We can let the club release back and through. We can do it over here, over here. We could even direct it out to the right, direct it out to the left. Essentially, we're so much more adaptable now with where we can take the club, as opposed to doing this, and then how do I do it over here? I've got to move the whole thing. Essentially, I've got to move to take this release pattern over there. It's not adaptable. As soon as I release, look where the club's going, it's starting to pass the hands, it's going left all the time. Challenge yourself. Start to make the flailing action, and then explore making it later, over here. What's it feel like to do it over here? And then hold your finish. And just get a sense of what that's like to be over in this space. Quite different if you're used to releasing here in this space. So once you've had a few practice swings, just getting a feel for that flail taking place over here. And notice the finish, the club face is still pointing that way, underneath the crossbar. Very similar to if we were throwing a ball underneath the crossbar. Look at the orientation of the hand and the wrist. This is representative of the loft. That's still underneath the crossbar. If it's an early release, hand's pointing at me, and look how the arms collapsed. So just visualise in your mind throwing the ball under the crossbar, recognise that finish, place the club there in the hands and just swing back and through. And now just feel the flail take you into that finish. And there we go, we've got the release, the check release, the low flight. More importantly, we're recognising the form of movement for that golf shot. So we can start to picture a flight and associate a feeling of a swing. These are powerful attachments. We've got to have attachments to shots that we're seeing. Otherwise, we're always limited to kind of one shot because we're not quite sure how to adapt the swing. What's the feeling? So recognising how you would throw a ball, low or high. Recognising the orientation of the hand at the end of the action. Put the club in, feel that action now all the way through, back and through. You can even make contact with the ground on the through swing just to feel the ground contact on the way to that finish. This would be representative of a high shot, back and through. That's loft up, loft down, face down. Very different finish. So this presents the opportunity to experience keeping the loft down and then release late and match that release to that lower flight. Alternatively, going high, lofting up. But notice that it's not here. Otherwise, the low point of the swing is too soon, too early. We're bringing in all this ground here. We want to release the club later. So the club's still descending, but it's not going to smash into the ground with the leading edge. It's going to release. That brings the bounce back into play. This is what you see good players do. They're using the bounce here. It's just sliding, bouncing off the ground. They've not got the leading edge digging in. So they can still swing down, release the club, engaging the bounce with the ground, and the loft is added through impact, resulting in the high trajectory finish. So you can see what shot, even without playing a shot, you can see what shot I'd be intending to play here as opposed to this. So recognising this is very important. So now swinging, the club is sliding along the ground because we're releasing here, but we've moved the club along to release here. We're not throwing the club head at the ball, releasing the club in the right place for the right finish. Caught a bit of the ground, that's not a problem. Even though the leading edge dug in a little bit, because it's a functional release which accesses the use of the bounce. And that's what guides the club out, gives us much more margin for error. So even if you don't quite catch it, you still get a decent shot. And that's what the good players are doing. Their percentage of success with their short game is so much higher because even if they don't quite catch it, they're releasing the golf club in a way which utilises the bounce, giving them much more forgiveness, so they still get a relatively good shot. And that's what we can do to pitch like a low handicapper.
Thought I heard my phone ring, but it disappeared.